Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're looking at another 27-inch 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED gaming monitor, this time from ASUS with their new ROG Strix XG27 AC-DNG. With most companies having already released their 360Hz model, ASUS are a little late to the party with this one, but generally I've been quite impressed with ASUS's OLED offerings, so I have high hopes for this model as well. The XG27 AC-DNG is very similar to what we've seen from past 360Hz QD OLEDs, as it uses the same Samsung display panel. Pricing is also quite similar. It has an MSRP of $800 US, though I've already seen it discounted to $700 recently. With ASUS offering both QD OLED and WOLED monitors, one of the few brands to do so, I'm guessing they want to have all bases covered, which is why they're adding a QD OLED model to their existing group of 1440p 240Hz and 480Hz WOLEDs. And it's pretty easy to get confused with the naming scheme here. ASUS already have the XG27AQ DMG on the market, which is their 1440p glossy 240Hz WOLED gaming monitor. That shouldn't be confused with the XG27AC DNG that we're testing today, just a two-letter difference between those models, so hopefully no one accidentally buys the wrong one. The design of the XG27 AC-DNG is very similar to previous ROG Strix monitors. It uses the same squarish base with the cutout for storing your phone. The QD OLED panel is surrounded by relatively thin bezels with a protruding tab on the bottom that houses an ROG logo. On the back of this logo is where you'll find the directional OSD controls. Then on the rear of the monitor, in general, we see the usual central box design that's deployed across most of ASUS's OLED range. This allows the thinness of the panel itself to shine. With most of the outer surfaces being made of plastic, this display doesn't have quite the same premium touch as their flagship ROG Swift monitors that have some metal elements, but I think it still looks pretty good. There's an RGB LED logo on the rear, and overall it's quite well built. The stand is sturdy and supports all of height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustment, though the maximum amount of height is only average to mediocre. There's a great set of connectivity here, one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, two HDMI 2.1 48GB/s ports with DSC, and a USB-C port supporting DP Alt mode and 90 watts of power delivery. In addition, we get a 3-port USB 5GB/s hub, a KVM switch, and DSC is required for both DP and HDMI, though it can be disabled in the OSD, which limits you to 180Hz. The OSD contains a great feature set that we've seen across a lot of ASUS's high-end monitors now. There's the usual unlocked color controls, plus a wide variety of gaming features, including an FPS counter, sniper mode, crosshairs, and more. The OLED care section is more feature-packed than before, now supporting even more settings, such as taskbar detection and boundary detection, though on previous monitors I've found those modes to be a bit annoying. But there is plenty of scope to customize the anti-burn-in features. There's a range of other settings too, like ELMB and anti-flicker, which complement a strong feature set. As the XG27 AC-DNG uses the same 3rd-gen QD OLED panel as the MSI, Gigabyte and Dell variants, its text quality is the same. The subpixel structure is enhanced relative to 1st-gen QD OLED panels, but with a moderate 110 ppi pixel density, it doesn't have the same level of sharpness and clarity as 32-inch 4K panels at 140 ppi. Relative to a similar 27-inch 1440p LCD, this QD OLED panel doesn't have as good text clarity. There is some pink-green fringing at the top and bottom of text due to the triangle RGB subpixel layout, and while this fringing is less noticeable than with 1st-gen panels, it's not as good as equivalent LCDs. Typically though, it's reasonable enough for occasional desktop app usage, and it continues to be a non-issue for content consumption like gaming. However, compared to 27-inch 1440p WOLED panels, especially the 240Hz ones, I think this QD OLED panel produces better text clarity, with the fringing issue on QD OLED less noticeable than with the text shadowing issue on WOLED with its RWBG subpixel layout. This isn't as true with the 480Hz panels that use a different subpixel structure, but they're more expensive. For panel composition and coding, this is your classic Samsung QD OLED panel experience, which is to say it's glossy with an anti-reflective surface treatment. The panel has the same issues described in previous QD OLED reviews. In brighter environments where the light sources are in front of the display, the panel has a tendency to reflect ambient light, raising blacks to the point where they appear somewhat grey. This impacts one of the key selling points to getting an OLED, which is its deep blacks. They just won't be that rich or deep in brighter conditions, especially relative to glossy WOLED panels. General reflection handling is decent, so mirror-like reflections aren't too bad, though being a glossy panel there is always going to be some amount of visible, defined reflections which get worse the brighter the conditions are. However, the issues with the coding can be minimized by optimizing the placement of light sources in the room so that lights are behind the display. The darker the environment, such as gaming in a dim or fully dark room, the better this QD-OLED panel looks, and in dim conditions you will typically get rich, deep OLED blacks. It's really hard to say whether this will be an issue for you, as it can be a case-by-case basis. Personally, I do find it annoying and one of the larger issues with QD-OLED panels, but if you primarily game at night, it's not anywhere near as much of a concern. At the very least, it's something to be aware of. With competing WOLED monitors though, most options use a matte anti-glare coating. It's a fairly heavy and effective coating that minimizes mirror reflections and better preserves blacks in brighter environments. However, the trade-off is grain. The matte WOLED coating is less clear than this glossy QD-OLED coating. The exception to this is the glossy ASUS ROG Strix XG27 AQD-MG, which combines the clarity of glossy with the deep blacks of WOLED panels. In my opinion, this glossy WOLED coating is much better than glossy QD-OLED. What's also important to be aware of is that OLEDs generally aren't great monitors for desktop usage, productivity apps, and web browsing because they are susceptible to permanent burn-in, and these new 360Hz QD-OLEDs are no exception. Anything with static content, toolbars, icons on screen for a long period of time, like you get with most desktop apps, is at risk of burning in. Conversely, dynamic content like gaming or watching videos is at practically no risk of burn-in, so don't worry about this if you're primarily using an OLED for gaming. As for burn-in warranty, ASUS are offering a now standard 3-year warranty that includes burn-in coverage as clearly stated on their website. Response time performance is excellent on this 1440p QD-OLED monitor, as it is for other OLED displays that we've tested so far. OLED offers lightning fast response times around the 0.25 millisecond mark at its maximum 360Hz refresh rate, and that leads to fantastic motion clarity. OLEDs also maintain the same performance at all refresh rates, so even when testing at 120 or 60Hz, we see similar results in the 0.3 millisecond range. This is a nice benefit for variable refresh rate gamers that results in a single overdrive mode experience. In contrast, many LCDs typically perform worse at lower refresh rates relative to their maximum refresh. On OLED monitors, the main limiting factor is the refresh rate itself. This means that on two OLEDs running at the same refresh rate, you'll get the same level of motion clarity, which is important when comparing across models. If you're using the XG27AC DNG at 130Hz and a 240Hz WOLED at 130Hz, both will produce the same motion clarity. The only advantage to getting a 360Hz QD-OLED over a lower refresh rate monitor is if you plan on using the upper part of that refresh rate range, in particular anything above 240 FPS or 240Hz. This is where the excellent clarity of this 360Hz panel comes into play. If you don't expect to be playing games above 240 FPS, then there is no practical advantage to a higher refresh rate OLED in terms of motion performance. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this QD-OLED and other OLED monitors. However, OLEDs are much faster than even the fastest LCDs that I've tested, and this is true whether we look at the best performance or average performance across the refresh rate range. Not only are OLEDs fast, they also have no overshoot artifacts, which can be an issue with some LCD models. When viewing cumulative deviation results, we can see that OLEDs get much closer to ideal response time behavior, and in most cases offer performance an order of magnitude better in this metric than LCDs. In practice, this leads to around a 1.5 times advantage in clarity at a given refresh rate. So 360Hz QD-OLEDs like this offer a similar experience to 540Hz LCDs. The only displays with clearly superior clarity are LCDs that offer elite backlight strobing, a feature that comes with its own set of limitations, like incompatibility with variable refresh rates. Like other recent ASUS OLEDs, this new 360Hz QD-OLED model supports eLMB black frame insertion. This feature works to boost the clarity of gaming by displaying every second frame as a black frame. It achieves this through technically running at 360Hz for a 180Hz signal input or 240Hz for a 120Hz signal input. Only fixed 180Hz and 120Hz is supported, and you also have to sacrifice variable refresh, HDR, and some brightness. At 180Hz using eLMB, it does look clearer than not using eLMB, but the implementation is far from perfect. As this is simply showing a black frame every second frame, the non-black image frames have a long strobe length, the length of each refresh cycle, which does lead to some blur relative to a well-strobed LCD that typically would produce a much shorter, sharper pulse. A short image pulse with a long black cycle produces the best image clarity, but this OLED really isn't capable of doing this. All it's doing is running its normal refresh cycle and switching between an image frame and a black frame. The end result is that the ELMB mode at 180Hz looks similar to 360Hz without BFI, and the same for 120Hz with BFI versus 240Hz without. It's a nice bonus feature, but I personally wouldn't use it, given you have to disable other features like HDR and VRR. The second feature is OLED anti-flicker, designed to combat variable refresh rate flicker in rare scenarios. Like we saw in the ASUS XG27AQ DMG, all this feature does is nerf the VRR range. With the setting off, the monitor uses a 48 to 360Hz range with low frame rate compensation, giving us an effective VRR range of 0 to 480Hz. With anti-flicker on middle, the variable refresh range shrinks to 180 to 360Hz, and on high it shrinks further to just 240 to 360Hz. What this means is that the high mode drops support for LFC. Any frame rate below 240 FPS will switch off variable refresh and lead to tearing or stuttering. In lower refresh rate situations, this means any potential flicker will just be replaced with tearing or stutter, which isn't ideal. In the medium mode, I found that LFC worked some of the time, but was a bit temperamental due to the minimum refresh being exactly half the maximum refresh. Occasionally, it just wouldn't work, which isn't ideal. Raising the minimum refresh can be effective at reducing flickering in some titles. I've experienced that before with ASUS anti-flicker tech in other monitors I've tested, but the implementation here is not optimal. Input latency is excellent, offering a sub 0.5 millisecond processing delay in both the SDR and HDR modes. Combined with fast response times and a higher refresh rate, this OLED feels very snappy to use and is well suited to competitive multiplayer titles. There is no difference in latency between the ASUS Gigabyte MSI and Dell variants in any mode tested, even at fixed 60Hz, where all three have between 5 and 8 milliseconds of processing lag. Power consumption is interesting only from a sense that the Dell and Asus models have roughly the same power consumption, while the Gigabyte and MSI models use around 7 watts more. Not sure why that's the case, but it's an interesting result. QD-OLEDs are at a disadvantage compared to WOLED when displaying white, and for this display type it presents a worst case scenario. All QD-OLEDs that we've tested so far offer a very similar color space. In the case of the XG27AC DNG, we're looking at 99.5% DCI-P3 coverage as well as 98% Adobe RGB coverage, strong results for viewing HDR content all working in those color spaces. In total, I saw 80.5% coverage of Rec 2020, which as you can see from the chart, is basically the same as other QD-OLEDs that I've tested, and it's a higher color gamut than competing WOLEDs. ASUS have impressed me lately with their out-of-the-box color accuracy, and XG27AC DNG is no exception. The default configuration has decent grayscale performance, including very accurate white balance, leading to a good delta E average of 5.9. But like with a lot of default configurations, the wide gamut here is fully enabled, which can lead to oversaturation for SDR content. Relative to other monitors, grayscale performance is mid-table, but certainly in the good range, while color checker is pretty typical for a QD-OLED with a wide gamut. The great news here is ASUS provide a lot of flexibility with their color modes, including the ability to enable an sRGB gamut clamp without locking out other features. This is in addition to a dedicated sRGB calibration mode, though I found just switching the display color space into sRGB produced great results. A delta E average of 4.78 in grayscale indicates a good level of factory calibration, and we also see low delta E's in saturation and color checker, meaning this mode is nice and accurate. Relative to other monitors, the XG27AC DNG puts up a good showing, though there is very stiff competition among sRGB modes these days, particularly among OLEDs. The Dell and MSI models are a step above in grayscale, the ASUS model isn't quite on that level. This is also the case in color checker, where the Dell model comes out ahead. However, I would say all four 360Hz QD OLEDs have a suitable level of factory calibration for gaming. With a wide range of color controls, decent color space emulation, and strong factory accuracy, there isn't a whole lot of reason to perform a full color calibration. I did so anyway using CalMan, and the results were good, but not a game changer compared to what you can do in hardware. If anything, that's a good thing. I want to see as much done in hardware as possible, so buyers don't have to rely on ICC profiles. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is practically identical to the other QD-OLED monitors I've tested. The limit for QD-OLED panels is around 250 nits at the moment, with the newest WOLEDs about 5% ahead, a negligible amount. This is below the level of most LCDs, but sufficient for typical indoor use cases. Also, ASUS offer a uniform brightness setting, which is not enabled by default, and when enabled, it caps the monitor to around this 246 nit level for all window sizes, rather than varying brightness as you resize windows, which is behavior that I find annoying. Minimum brightness is great at 14 nits. I was very impressed with the viewing angles of this panel. They are very wide, which makes it easy to view the display even at quite extreme angles. It really looks excellent. This also means that there is a large sweet spot for viewing this QD-OLED, and you won't notice issues like the edges being slightly lower contrast or a bit washed out, which can be an issue with some flat LCD panels, particularly VAs. Uniformity was also very good with my unit, nice and uniform viewing full white and no dirty screen effect viewing dark greys. The Asus XG27 ACDNG is well suited to HDR from a hardware perspective. OLED panels including QD-OLED directly emit light and have individual pixel control, which makes them ideal for displaying HDR content. This feature allows each pixel to independently vary from fully switching off to displaying bright highlights, giving us deep zero-level blacks and per pixel local dimming. The level of control OLEDs provide minimizes blooming in high contrast scenarios and allows for clean distinction between bright and dark areas that are close together. Compared to LCDs with a multi-zone backlight, OLEDs have far fewer ugly illumination artifacts, which are most noticeable when displaying difficult scenarios like star fields or subtitles, and there are no zone transitions as bright objects move around the display. With per pixel control as its main advantage, OLEDs are best at displaying high contrast scenes with rich shadow detail, which is a key aspect to a good HDR presentation. Darker content interspersed with dazzling bright highlights brings out the best in OLED displays, as does HDR content with fast motion. For gamers especially, input latency on most OLEDs is low in the HDR mode. The weakness to the HDR presentation on an OLED is overall brightness. While peak brightness can be high in the best cases, full screen brightness is low, and this limits the punch in bright daytime scenes. LCDs may not have per pixel control, but zoned backlights can simply get significantly brighter in bright scenes. Depending on what you want out of an HDR monitor, your preference could swing more towards LCDs or more towards OLEDs, but typically speaking, OLEDs are a great choice that deliver a fantastic HDR presentation. In terms of HDR configurations, Asus offer the same set as other recent QD-OLEDs with three main options. The Display HDR 400 True Black mode is limited to 450 nits of peak brightness, but is accurate with great EOTF tracking and does not dim the screen in brighter, higher APL content. This is the most accurate mode with the least brightness on offer. The console HDR mode with adjustable HDR on is equivalent to peak 1000 modes seen on other QD-OLED monitors. Brightness now reaches 1000 nits in low APL scenes, and EOTF tracking is decent at 2 and 10% window sizes. However, at higher window sizes, which show performance in brighter scenes, EOTF tracking is much less accurate as the display dims above a certain average screen brightness. The last option is also the console HDR mode, but with the dynamic brightness boost enabled. This is similar to the HDR game mode on the Gigabyte Aorus FO27Q3. It retains 1000 nits of peak brightness and doesn't as aggressively dim the screen in high APL content, but this comes at a cost. Darker scenes are now much brighter than they should be. This was actually more difficult to test than I expected on this monitor. I was able to confirm in real-world darker scenes that brightness is indeed inflated in this configuration, but EOTF tracking doesn't always show this, suggesting there is some sort of dynamic processing going on that may change the EOTF curve in some situations. Not sure on that one, but this constant APL test shows typical behavior in dimmer scenes. None of these modes offers the best experience for HDR content. You'll still need to pick and choose what aspects you want to preference. When largely viewing brighter, higher APL scenes, the True Black mode is the best. When viewing dimmer, lower APL scenes, the console HDR mode is best. Enabling dynamic brightness boost is great if you want to view brighter scenes accurately while boosting low APL brightness, but in my opinion, it isn't really a fix for the issues found in the other modes where either brightness is capped or the screen dims in bright scenes. My preference as a general choice, which has been the case for most QD-OLEDs, is the Peak 1000 configuration, which on this Asus monitor is the console HDR mode, but I have heard varying opinions with others liking the experience in the other two configurations. The XG27 ACDNG performs as expected in synthetic brightness tests. All modes deliver about 250 nits full screen, about 450 nits displaying a 10% window, and then as high as 1000 nits with a 2% window. The exception to this is the True Black mode, which is capped to 450 nits. For other monitors, the most accurate mode that offers full panel brightness is being used in the chart. In real scene brightness, we get the same experience as other QD-OLED gaming monitors. The Display HDR 400 mode doesn't exceed 450 nits and delivers low average brightness, but there's no panel dimming in brighter scenes. The console HDR mode does reach nearly 1000 nits in real-world content, but isn't as bright for bright scenes and has panel dimming issues. The mode with dynamic brightness boost delivers the best of both worlds, however has accuracy issues as discussed earlier. Ultimately, the brightness experience this QD-OLED panel brings is decent, but not at the level of the best OLEDs on the market today in this area, which are WOLEDs. The XG27AQ-DMG, for example, does not suffer from anywhere near the level of panel dimming and is a little brighter on average. That's not to say QD-OLEDs offer a poor experience in HDR scenes, because they still look great, but the best WOLEDs I've tested at the moment have a small edge. On the flip side, QD-OLEDs have much higher color brightness than WOLEDs, as well as a wider color gamut, which leads to a much better color volume result. In ICT-CP, the XG27ACDNG produces around an MDC of 21, best case, whereas WOLEDs are more in the 15 range, and in this case, higher is better. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. ASUS do a good job of advertising this monitor with accurate information for most aspects. Response time performance, as usual, is exaggerated and misleading, but buyers are still getting a top-tier experience. ASUS also provide a strong feature set, which leads to many green ticks in the feature support matrix. Some features are more limited than others, like ELMB black frame insertion, but for the most part this is a feature-rich monitor, especially when it comes to connectivity, contrast, and motion performance. Overall, the ASUS ROG Strix XG27ACDNG is pretty much what I expected. Another great 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED gaming monitor. I've now tested 4 of these models from MSI, Dell, Gigabyte, and now ASUS, and there's really not much separating them at all, so you can safely pick whichever one you like, knowing you'll get a fantastic product. Like the other variants I've tested, the XG27ACDNG delivers excellent performance. It has outstanding motion clarity at 360Hz, similar to that of 500Hz LCDs, as well as very fast response times across the refresh rate range. While it isn't quite as clear as the best strobed LCDs at super high refresh rates or the newest 480Hz OLEDs, these QD-OLED panels offer a top experience for competitive gamers that want speed but don't want to sacrifice adaptive sync, viewing angles, or resolution. This monitor also offers something for buyers that just want a visually stunning 1440p gaming display. You don't have to utilize the 360Hz refresh rate to benefit from deep blacks, per pixel local dimming, and a great HDR presentation with up to 1000 nits of peak brightness. This ASUS model is well calibrated from the factory, and while it's not quite as good as the Alienware AW2725DF in this area, it's still among the best gaming monitors for accuracy. Not every aspect of this monitor is perfect though. OLED brings with it the risk of permanent burn-in, so it isn't well suited to lots of productivity work or static app usage. The subpixel structure at this pixel density isn't quite as clear for text as traditional LCDs, though it's a step above WOLEDs. The panel composition and coding isn't the best for use in brighter environments either. So with all 4 variants delivering very similar performance, how do you choose between them? That's a tricky proposition. There aren't many unique features or performance differences that make one model a standout. The ASUS and Gigabyte models both include a boosted brightness HDR configuration, but I wouldn't necessarily base my purchasing decision around it. The ASUS model has black frame insertion, but that's a niche feature many won't use. The MSI model allows you to fine-tune OLED care features to the largest extent of any OEM. The Dell model is the best calibrated version, but along with the Gigabyte model, lacks decent USB-C power delivery. Unless you specifically want a certain feature that only one brand is offering, the main deciding factor is the price. But even this doesn't change much between the variants, with the typical price for all models sitting between $700 and $900 US, depending on current sales. $800 appears to be the standard price, and that's the MSRP of the ASUS XG27ACDNG. Right now, you can get one for $700, which isn't the lowest ever price for a 360Hz QD OLED, but it's pretty reasonable considering pricing trends over the last 6 months. Honestly, I would just get whichever model is the cheapest in your region. The other factor to consider is whether you really need a 360Hz OLED. When gaming at lower refresh rates, for example a single player game at 120 FPS, there's no difference in motion clarity between a 240Hz and 360Hz OLED, so you won't benefit from the additional refresh rate a faster OLED brings. 360Hz does give you more headroom for future performance upgrades and the use of frame generation technology, but for a lot of gamers, 240Hz is going to be enough. And with 240Hz OLEDs being much cheaper right now, sometimes hitting below $600 US, they could be a better bang for buck entry point to OLED gaming. Anyway, those are the things you'll have to weigh up. The good news is that there are no deal breaker flaws with the ASUS XG27ACDNG. It's very much the same sort of QD OLED experience we've come to love over the last year in a 1440p 360Hz package. That's it for this review. If you're interested in supporting the channel and the in-depth testing that we do here at Monitors Unboxed, then please consider signing up to our Patreon page. If you sign up, you gain access to some pretty cool benefits. There's our Discord community, which is a great place to chat about monitors, get some recommendations. I'm in there at times if you want to get my advice on those sorts of things. We also have our ICC profiles and calibrated settings that we use throughout our testing process. That is available for Patreon members as well. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.